So dear students, professors, members of the Bocconi University board, staff, alumni, representatives of companies and institutions, I would like to thank you for being with us today for this special occasion, and namely the workshop Europe After Brexit, Shaping a New Era. And I'm extremely pleased to see this room literally packed. Thank you very much. Brexit is indeed a turning point in the history of Europe, and since it happened, it was clear it would have led us into scenarios we have not thought of. In fact, envisaging Europe after Brexit is quite a challenge, but at the same time is an extremely fascinating exercise for professors, students, and all the stakeholders that deal with the broad world of social sciences like we do. And this is the reason why we have chosen to discuss this topic while announcing the launch of a double-degree program in European politics and policymaking, which will further strengthen the relationship between the London School of Economics and Political Science and Bocconi University. So let me therefore give a warm welcome to our speakers. First of all, Dame Minouche Shafik, a professor of economics and since 2016 the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Our president, Mario Monti. Let me also wholeheartedly thank Ms. Rachel Sanderson, correspondent in Italy of the Financial Times, that kindly decided to orchestrate this beautiful event. As you all know, Brexit-related issues are evolving day by day at an even faster pace now as we are getting close to the deadline. And unluckily, we learned over the weekend that for this reason, Mr. Michel Barnier will not be able to join us. However, he has kindly sent a video message, and so we will learn his view directly from him. Higher education institutions of global standing tend to build partnership and to work together both in research and teaching. This is particularly important in times of disruption, as the benefit of networks and alliances is a way to overcome the cost of isolation. And let me remark that this is particularly important today in a moment in which politics seems to create barriers and friction between states, something which doesn't belong to the world of education and science. In this respect, the London School of Economics and Bocconi University have been cooperating in various domains of the social sciences, with a special focus on research in economics, management, politics, and law. We have also built together a curricular level some activity. For example, students pursuing management studies have since 1991 had the opportunity to take part to the SEMS graduate program. And since last year, we started a cooperation also at the undergraduate level. We are here today to debate over a crucial topic, but also to celebrate the creation of a double-degree program between the two institutions. Starting from the next academic year, talented students will have the chance to combine advanced education in political sciences and public policy analysis at Bocconi, and to receive the tools to critically analyze European politics and policy making in an international setting at the London School of Economics and Political Science. At the end of the 2 years, the students enrolled in this program will receive both the Master of Science degrees. And we are extremely proud of these achievements. And that's the reason why I would like, of course, to wholeheartedly thank the director of London School of Economics. And I would like to take the occasion to acknowledge the two teams that work together. On the side of Bocconi, particularly our Dean of International Affairs, Professor Caselli, who is sitting in the first row, and Laura Candotti, head of the market division. And on the side of London School of Economics, Professor Featherstone, who's also in the first row, and all the team that supported him at the London School of Economics. A final thank you to Silvia Colombo, who orchestrated this event in a splendid manner. And we all hope that this double-degree program will be the beginning of a new cooperation in the world of political science between these two institutions. And I look forward to listening to the words of wisdom of our panelists. And I wish you a wonderful conference this afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Verona. We are welcoming you today to the debate on Europe after Brexit, shaping a new era, with Dame Minouche and President Monti here from Bocconi University. Prior to that, as we've said, Mr. Barnier was unable to attend today, and he has sent a message from his office, which I will read to you now before we go to a video, which he has made specially for the event. Mr. Barnier wanted me to convey his sincere apologies for not being able to be here with us today. He was keen on sharing his personal views and discussing with all of you about Brexit and the future of Europe. But at the last moment, his presence has been required in Brussels for a new series of discussions with the UK government, 40 days away from Brexit Day. Mr. Barnier still wanted to contribute to this discussion with a short video message that we will show now and which could set the scene for the debate here today.
Dear President, dear Mario, dear Rector, dear Dame Minouche Shafik, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, very sorry that I can't be with you in Milan this afternoon. I wanted to be there, but I need to be in Brussels today for discussions, or new discussions with the UK government. Nevertheless, I still want to say a few words to you. The launch of this double degree is important. It shows that two of our most prestigious universities, one on the continent, one in Britain, but both in Europe, will continue to work together. They will even step up their cooperation after the UK has left the EU. I have always said that our future partnership with the UK should be as broad and ambitious as possible. And your initiative is a good example of what we can achieve together. But I also understand that many of you are concerned by Brexit. In only 40 days, the UK will leave the EU. I personally regret this decision. In today's world, we have strong reasons to be united, not divided. But we must accept the sovereign decision of the British people. A member state has the right to leave the Union. The Union is no prison. The EU is a project built by countries and people who choose to pursue shared dreams, peace rather than war, solidarity rather than isolation, prosperity through cooperation. It is also a project founded in law, which promotes a rules-based international order. Over the last 18 months, we have negotiated a very detailed agreement, nearly 600 pages, with the UK. It brings certainty where Brexit creates uncertainty. For EU citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in the EU. For the many farmers, regions, businesses and universities who benefit from the EU budget. For those concerned by other separation issues, such as the protection of geographical indications, like Gorgonzola or Scotch whisky, and for the problems that Brexit has created for the island of Ireland, this agreement protects the peace and stability in the island of Ireland, but also protects our single market. Ladies and gentlemen, in these negotiations, there is no dogmatism on our part. We have simply looked for pragmatic solutions for the problems created by Brexit. The UK is leaving the EU. In doing so, it cannot also ask us to weaken the single market. President, ladies and gentlemen, the President Juncker and President Tusk told Prime Minister May that we will not reopen the withdrawal agreement. It is a carefully balanced compromise between the EU and the UK, but we are open to more ambition when it comes to our future relationship. The joint political declaration outlines a broad future relationship. We could go even further if the UK's red lines evolve. For instance, we are open to the principle of a permanent customs union should the UK want it. The UK will also be able to take part in EU programs that are open to third countries under the relevant conditions. If the UK respects this condition, and in particular if it contributes to the EU budget, Italian students could be in a position to study in the UK under the Erasmus programme, even after Brexit. And British universities would still be eligible for research projects with their European partners. Since day one, the EU's position has been clear, and since November 2018, we have a withdrawal agreement that we agreed with the UK government, not against the UK government. It is now time for each side to take their responsibilities and face the consequences of their choices. If there is no positive majority in the UK in favour of the deal, then the UK will leave the EU without an agreement. This is clearly not our scenario, but the EU is prepared for it. Ladies and gentlemen, for 2 years now, we have dealt with the consequences of Brexit. But we must also draw from the lessons of Brexit and ask ourselves why 52% of the British people voted to leave the EU. During the campaign, there were misleading statements and a lack of information about the EU. But there was also a feeling that Europe does not listen to people, a Europe that does not protect them against the downsides of globalization, a Europe that does not provide a better future for Europeans. We must listen to this. We must understand where it comes from and respond to it by acknowledging that Europe made some errors, by going back to the foundation of the European project. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the point of the European project? What should the point be? Since the Treaty of Rome, Europe is about pooling resources to build common goods. The European coal and steel community first, the common agriculture policy, our cohesion policy, our common currency, the euro. We must take care of these common goods. We are all co-owners of them. Ladies and gentlemen, we can be proud of these common goods. Of course, we need our nations, our national identities, cultures and traditions. But our nations alone will not be in a position to tackle global challenges like climate change, migrations, industrial change or terrorism. To tackle these challenges, we need to build new common goods. Together, we need to build a green Europe. Europe should be the first carbon-neutral economy by 2050. We need to invest in key technologies like the new generation of solar panels, green chemistry and batteries. Together, we must invest in basic skills for coding, artificial intelligence and data analysis. Together, we must progress towards common European defense. In Europe, our national budgets fund 17 different tanker systems. The US funds only one system. We also need to pool defense equipment as proposed by President Juncker. And of course, together, we must build a common system for the management of our external borders. We also need a genuine common asylum policy, while continuing to work with the country of origin and the root causes of migration. Ladies and gentlemen, none of these projects will happen without you. In a few months of years, you will graduate from one or two of the best universities in Europe. Most of you will have studied abroad thanks to the Erasmus program, thanks to research programs funded by the EU, or simply thanks to the free movement of people. This surely all seems natural to you, but don't forget that these achievements are fragile, sometimes very fragile. and that sudden breathtaking is possible. Do not take anything for granted. If you want to preserve these achievements, you must fight for them. Share your vision of Europe. Engage yourself in particular ahead of the European elections. Your words, your actions will have more weight than you might think. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll turn now immediately to Dame Minouche, who, after those comments from Commissioner Barnier, your words, your actions will have more weight than you think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here today to celebrate LSE's relationship with Bocconi and to launch a new double degree in European and international public policy and politics. I wanted to particularly thank Mario Monti, who is the president of Bocconi, and Gian Mario Verona for launching this initiative, and also the colleagues both at the LSE and at Bocconi who have worked together to build this new program. Now, our topic for today is Europe after Brexit. And as I was preparing for this event, I did a little bit of research on social media, as one has to do these days. And I discovered that there is a pizzeria in Venice that is now offering a Brexit pizza on the menu. And when the waiter was asked, what is this Brexit pizza alongside the prosciutto, i funghi, and the quattro stagioni? They said, what's on this Brexit pizza? The waiter said, well, we promise that it comes with everything, but it actually comes with nothing, and it is very expensive and very hard to digest. I think it's best that I leave the cooking and the digestion of the Brexit pizza to Michel Barnier and the UK negotiators. And what I thought I would do today is step back and ask two longer-term questions. What were the causes of Brexit, and what does it tell us about the state of politics in Europe today? And what is the role of universities in Europe after Brexit? So let me start with the causes of Brexit. I think the underlying causes of Brexit are rooted in two issues: economic insecurity and issues of identity. And I see it as part of a wider populist backlash. In an article in today's Financial Times, I talk a little bit about how populism has actually been around a long time. In fact, I discovered that the first international conference in the world on populism occurred at the London School of Economics in 1967. But it is clearly experiencing a resurgence today. Today, populist political parties have won 25% of the vote in European elections. There are populist parties from the left and of the right, but they have two things in common. One, they are anti-elitist, and two, they are anti-pluralist. They have a majoritarian view that they represent the will of the people. And there's a sort of exclusionary identity politics where those who are not the people are enemies of the people. And enemies of the people might include independent judges, critical media, opinionated academics, and independent regulators. It is this being against pluralism that makes populists dangerous for democracy. So let me talk a little bit more about the underlying causes, and let me start with economic insecurity. Globally, we know that globalization has resulted in huge gains in incomes of the middle class in emerging markets and the top 1% in the advanced economies. The middle class and the lower middle classes in most advanced economies have not done so well. In a recent study by McKinsey, they found that 65 to 70% of households in 25 advanced economies, the middle part of the income distribution, experienced flat or falling incomes between 2005 and 2014. And young and less educated workers were the ones who suffered the most. And polling in those countries showed that many people felt that their children would be poorer than their parents. Perhaps the most extreme case is in Italy, where the massive recession after the financial crisis in 2008 meant that real market incomes fell for every quartile of the income distribution. And government austerity measures after that made it worse for all income groups. Not surprisingly, those with stagnant or falling incomes are more likely to have negative attitudes to immigration and to trade. In the UK, after the financial crisis, government taxes and transfers fully compensated people for the costs of the crisis, but only for a few years. After that, the accumulation of debt and deficits meant that austerity measures had to be implemented and welfare cuts resulted, which unleashed significant grievances. In fact, a very interesting econometric study in the UK finds a very strong relationship between those parts of the country which were hardest hit by those cuts and who voted for the UK Independence Party and who voted for Brexit. If you have a map of the UK and you show where the cuts happened and where the voting was, it's strikingly similar. In addition to the deteriorating economic conditions for many low and middle income households after the crisis, there's also considerable fear about the future in light of automation, issues around competitiveness, the precarious nature of work. In countries like the UK and in Italy, lower skilled workers face higher unemployment and a growing reliance on temporary contracts. And that economic insecurity that results from that means that they fear for their own futures and for the futures of their children. And needless to say, that plays out in who they vote for. Let me turn to the threats to identity and why I think that played a huge role in the Brexit vote. Now, populists need outsiders and enemies to unify the people. Now, recently, that has tended to focus on immigrants, whether they're Syrians or Africans in Europe, or whether it's Mexicans in the US. Now, the concern about rising immigration is real. It's not just racism. One can't dismiss it so easily. If you look at most advanced economies today, the proportion of the population that is foreign-born has actually gone up to historically high levels. And many who support populists feel that their country is changing in ways that they do not like. It's becoming more multicultural, more liberal, more religiously diverse, which means that their identities are being challenged. And this issue of identity is particularly problematic in Europe, given the history and the strategy of the European Union to get people to rise above their national identities and create a pan-European identity. And for very understandable reasons, the European project has focused on that, given the horrible history of nationalism in Europe. And so Europe had created a flag, an anthem, a currency, and freedom of movement was a huge part of that, trying to reduce localist feeling and creating technocratic institutions like the ECB, the European Commission, to try and depoliticize decision-making. Erasmus was a huge part of that, getting young people to move across European boundaries and to create a European identity. And it's been hugely successful. I'm not sure how reliable the figure is, but I'm told that there are now 1 million Erasmus babies in Europe as a result of marriages and partnerships across people from different European nations. But while European elites, frankly people like us, became comfortable moving between countries, speaking multiple European languages, the vast majority of Europeans still live within 10 kilometers of where they were born. Now, let me turn to my second theme, is what is the role of universities after Brexit and in this wider context of rising populism? I want to take the long view here, especially in Italy, which is home to the oldest university in Europe, Bologna, of course, which was founded in the 11th century. And universities are among the longest surviving institutions in the world, for a good reason. The basic business model of universities, of training young people alongside experienced scholars who are the guardians of our knowledge and the creators of new knowledge, really has worked very well for millennia and hasn't changed very much in millennia. In a wonderful letter that was sent to Jean-Claude Juncker and Theresa May by 24 Nobel laureates in Europe, they reminded us that Europe was the home of the Enlightenment and the birthplace of modern science. But partly as a result of two devastating world wars, Europe suffered a decline relative to the US in the creation of its intellectual capital. But this decline has been reversed in recent decades, in large part as a result of the ease of collaboration across borders, which has been enabled by the European Union. Now, the current populist rise is not just a threat to democracy, it's also a huge challenge for universities. Universities are factories for producing precisely the kinds of experts that populists like to dismiss. The strongest determinant of who voted for Brexit, and for other populist movements in general, is education. That is the biggest determinant of who voted for Brexit. And so much of the populist narrative is that the elite have rigged the system in their interest and in their favor. And if you look at the data on income distribution and wealth distribution and social mobility, it would tend to support that argument. In many places, universities have become vehicles for hoarding of opportunities rather than sharing them more widely in societies. And I think universities need to respond to this challenge by reasserting their values, by being more inclusive, by enhancing opportunities for social mobility, by providing scholarships to students from less advantaged backgrounds, and by doing research on what are the new economic, political, and social models we need to develop to respond to the populist threat. One of the things I'm proudest of about the London School of Economics is that we were ranked top in the UK, now for the second year in a row, for being the best at getting students from underprivileged backgrounds to the LSE. Our graduates are the highest earning in the UK, even taking account of family background and income. And through that, by bringing students in from underprivileged backgrounds and projecting them onto a much higher income path, we have become a vehicle for social mobility, and I think that's hugely important. Now, going forward, we know that universities thrive in open societies, where ideas can be debated openly and tested rigorously. And we know that ideas don't respect borders, and we know that today, the most outstanding research in the world, as evidenced by citation rankings, is being produced through international collaboration. We also know that universities are vital for success in a knowledge-based economy, and that, especially in the last 20 years, about 2/3 of economic growth in advanced economies can be attributed to science and innovation. And if Europe is going to compete against the behemoths of the US and China, universities will have to be at the center of any economic strategy. A line of argument that was made very strongly in a recent report by Pascal Lamy for the European Union. So how will Brexit impact this? I think we face a choice. We could put up barriers against the free flow of faculty and students. We could apportion our research funding in national silos and dilute the excellence that competition brings. We could subsume the creation of new knowledge to short-term political priorities. Fortunately, I don't hear anyone in a university in Europe making those arguments, although there are others outside the university world who are making those arguments. I hope that given the huge mutual benefits from an open approach, that we can find a way to preserve and actually increase the flow of curiosity-driven academic collaboration, whatever form Brexit takes. Now, we've been thinking a lot at the LSE about our strategy for the next decade. And in the course of those conversations at the London School of Economics, Everyone at the school is committed to maintaining our international character. We have the most international student population of any university in the world. 70% of our students are international and 30% are from the UK. 37% of our faculty are EU nationals. That's 37%. And they are critical to the vitality of our research and teaching. And we're doing everything we can to encourage government policies that enable us to retain our valued EU colleagues and students and enable us to recruit even more of them. EU research collaborations are also vital. Today, the majority of our international collaborative partners are in other EU countries, and it's the fastest growing part of our research. Since the start of the EU Framework Programme in 2000, LSE has been part of more than 220 collaborative partnerships across Europe. And these have been in hugely important fields like health, like climate, like energy, like transport, like cities. And we must do everything we can to sustain those links. And that's why we also welcome the recently announced European Universities Initiative, which will enable students to benefit from learning in multiple universities. We've been also thinking a lot about what future we're preparing young people for, given the impact of aging, technology, and various other global forces. We know that this generation is going to have to work longer. They're probably going to have to change jobs much more often than previous generations. They'll need to retool their skills multiple times in their lives. They'll need skills that complement what robots can do, since most routine and repetitive tasks will be automated. And they'll need to be creative and be able to work with diverse groups of people. And they may need to be entrepreneurial at various points in their careers. Our educational offer has to adapt to all of those things. Which brings me to the purpose of today. The degree we're launching here today is consistent with our aspirations for the future and for our future strategy. It represents a commitment to openness, to Europe, and to educating the next generation in a collaborative spirit. This joint degree with Bocconi will give students from across Europe, including the UK, an opportunity to deepen their knowledge of public policy with a European focus. And our young people will continue to need to know how to work together, collaboratively, and understand Europe's role in the world. And that's why I'm so delighted to be here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dame Minouche. President Monti, would you like to take on to the podium now as well? Thank you very much for a follow-up address. That was fascinating. Thank you very much indeed, and inspiring. Thank you.
I'm delighted to join Rector Verona in expressing Bocconi's great satisfaction for the agreement between LSE and Bocconi on the dual degree, double degree actually, in European and international public policy and politics. I'm very grateful to Dame Minouche and to Professor Featherstone for having steered with great will, as there has been on our side, this process. I believe it might have happened even without Brexit, but if Brexit has heartened further our motivations, then this will have to be accounted among, I believe, the not too long list of positives from Brexit. I will briefly touch upon 3 points. What are the concrete lessons so far that one can draw from Brexit? By the way, on the causes of Brexit and many other things, I completely share Minouche's very persuasive analysis, but what are some lessons that one can draw from that experience so far? Secondly, what will be the landscape of the European Union's economic policies after Brexit? And thirdly, what will be the political landscape of the European Union after the European elections, particularly once Brexit has been completed? Well, on the first point, concrete lessons from Brexit, I see putting ourselves particularly in the perspective of a country like Italy, but I believe more broadly as well. I see in particular three angles of drawing lessons and warnings. One is the risks of using direct democracy methods when applied to highly complex issues. The referendum was used in 2016, unquestionably applied to an extremely complex issue about the remain or leave, and it was done in spite of all the good work. In particular, I have in mind the thick couple of volumes from Her Majesty's Treasury on the consequences of a possible Brexit at the time, but the analysis of what might be the consequences of Brexit and the various modalities of Brexit was nowhere close to what was needed to inform the decisions of a country. And what we saw has been that the country which we have been admiring and envying, certainly for decades, for its unique degree of pragmatism, for its perfect seamless continuity between the universities, the think tanks, the empirical analysis on the ground, the information to and the work within the public administration, the link between the public administration advice and the politicians' decisions, all that was so perfect that, for example, we in the continent have been trying to draw from that and the American experience, setting up think tanks, consultative papers. We have imitated their method of arriving at well-informed decision-making. Well, that has left and has given place, I say it with friendly admiration now for the resilience of that great country, to a total mess and disarray with the total disarticulation going from the top of the political system to the ordinary people. For example, the marvelous link between political power in London and the city and British industry, a continuum of power which had for many decades had the consequence, for example, of easily dividing the rest of the EU in discussions in Brussels, all that has suddenly evaporated. And we are now confronted with a political system which is at pains in making any decision. The second lesson is cynicism in using Europe for domestic political purposes. I believe that David Cameron, whom I admired and was a good friend of, will remain in the history books, not for the reasons any statements might wish to remain in history books, because there is an example to the extreme of a pattern followed in reality by many, many government leaders of European countries in the last several years. Namely, how dangerous it is and how cynical it is to use Europe for domestic political purposes. When David Cameron decided to call a referendum, it was obviously not in the general interest of Europe, almost obviously, but clearly not either in the general interest of the UK, not even in the general interest of the Conservative Party, I'm afraid, but in the interest of him trying to strengthen his hold on the Conservative Party. Look at the consequences and the disruptions that are probably there to stay for years and centuries. He's by no means the only one, but I like to think of other very rare templates of politicians in Europe. There is one, like Helmut Kohl, who lost power in his national elections in 1998 in Germany, because he put the interest of Europe, which he saw inextricably linked to the interest of a united Europe, in front of his personal convenience. He was defeated by Schröder, who at that time did not want a single currency, but Kohl, with his determination, finally had the single currency for Germany and Europe. And I think his place in history is not going to be worse than the one of David Cameron, for sure. And then a lesson also interesting for this country, how difficult it is to leave Europe, to leave to leave the European Union. It has been very difficult for countries to, except for the happy founding fathers, happy few, to join the European Union, with all a series of different approximations, tasks, demonstrations to give of being prepared, etc., etc. But how difficult it is to leave the EU. Well, I don't need to spend words on the current Brexit experiment of leaving, which is the first one being played out in concrete reality. But let me just bring the attention of my fellow Italians to what was said many times 1 or 2 years ago by one and the other of the parties which now shape Italy's majority, namely, I must say, with candid and even nice naivete, saying publicly, well, we will ask for better conditions for Italy in the treaties or in the policies, and if ever we will be unable to get them, we will leave, Italy will leave the Eurozone or the European Union. Well, number one, it's not that the UK has achieved enormously in terms of bargaining power because of a threat of leaving. And I'm not sure that our rampant, nicely disorderly political system would be able to display the same empire-like ability to negotiate displayed unsuccessfully by Her Majesty's government. Coming more quickly to my second point, the EU economic policy without the UK. I am sure, personally, I'm afraid that the Brexit will be a big, big loss operation, both for the UK, but also for the European Union, for broad political and strategic and civilization reasons, but also because I'm afraid the policy making of the EU without the annoying and stubborn UK minister at the table of the Council will be less good. Will no doubt be easier and simpler, but less good. Well, we want Europe, so says the Treaty of Lisbon, to be a highly competitive social market economy. And certainly the market is by no means the only element of that, but is the first basic platform. And the single market in particular. Now, we should all remember that the single market has been, more than anything else, a British construction in the late 80s, led intellectually and politically by Margaret Thatcher and her Commissioner for the Internal Market in Brussels in the Delors Commission, Lord Cockfield. And how great a paradox it is, Minouche, isn't it, that it should be a British conservative government to take away from itself its so highly successful export product to the rest of Europe, which is the single market, a state of things for which we discovered on this occasion, we forgot about that, the Norwegians, for example, are paying huge amounts of money each year to be able to play economically in it. Well, having said that, the champion in EU policy making, the champion for well-functioning markets, for competition, for opening, for structural reform, for not being shy vis-à-vis the challenges of globalization, has always been the UK. I have been commissioner first for the single market, then for competition. I hated some discussions with the British Prime Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer on particular points, because they are, as Lord Cockfield, who was already an old man, when I visited him in London, having taken his job in Brussels, I remember he said to me, "You should never forget that we Brits are brutal." I was a bit shocked by that expression, which is not entirely unfounded. And so it may be difficult to deal with them, but certainly the intellectual and political forces which has driven most consistently in European policy making the motives of the market, of competition, etc., has been the UK. Now, without the UK, I can visualize the things. For the commissioners at the Commission table wanting to bring more market and competition in Europe, it will be a bit more difficult not being able to count on the alliance of the British Commissioner. Same thing in the Council, same thing in the Parliament. And there is a risk, I believe, maybe it is already a bit visible, that Germany and France, on occasions, in fact, with the help of Italy, although Italy might believe that it is not helping, but might be helping in fact, retrenching a bit towards neo-corporatism, which would make the competitiveness of Europe even more difficult to improve. Last, politics at the EU level after the European elections. Here I want to round off with a note, probably unfounded, but of optimism. There will be the European elections, no doubt, according to any polls, that the sovereignist parties in all countries in different variations will come up strongly. No poll at the moment suggests that they might put together, earn a majority in the European Parliament, also because we will discover soon that the preferences of the more or less pro-Europe parties can be aggregated, but not the preferences of the sovereigntist parties, because they could be aggregated on issues like reducing the powers of Brussels or making the borders of Europe totally closed to anybody. But then their platform is a nationalistic platform, and therefore, by definition, they will be at odds with each other. But at any rate, the making European policies will be more difficult, even more difficult than in the past, because the Popular Party, the Socialist Party, the Liberals and the Greens, and probably it will take 3 or 4 of these to form a majority, will be in a weaker position than previously. But why I speak of optimism? Well, because in my, no doubt, excessive confidence in competition, I believe that competition helps even political systems to stay in good health. I am convinced that capitalism, for example, has delivered better outcomes, has been more measured, more self-restrained, more performant, until it had more or less a challenger, the communist system. When it lost the challenger and became a monopolist, then the excesses of capitalism, of short-termism, of financial capitalism as an end for itself, etc., became more evident, unchecked, brought to the great financial and economic crisis, and may again bring to that, maybe. So what has this to do with the European Union? What I imagine in my rare moments of optimism, but a day like this, of course, is definitely among those, is that playing in retrospect, maybe one day we will say that pro-Europeanism, when it was an unquestioned majority force in the European Parliament and in Europe, brought to some excesses, like the EU maybe intruding in too much details in domestic affairs, etc., etc. But then, ever since the sovereignist challenge came up strongly, historians will say after May 2019, Europeanism has been forced to look more deeply into itself, to separate what is essential from what is redundant in the European construction, and maybe being challenged by an opposing force has become more vital and has brought to a better synthesis on what the European Union is, and maybe, but this would be going a bit too far, if this improvement through the challenge of sovereignism were to be really there, visible and positive, maybe the UK from out there might one day consider making use again of some odd form of decision-making to see that on the lines strongly asserted in 2019 by LSE and Bocconi, it could reapproach the European Union with a more open mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, President Monti, for providing us with a profound and expansive view about the dark and some of the light after the exit of the brutal Brits, as you put it. I think we're going to go to a few questions now before we open to the floor. As Dame Minouche mentioned, you wrote an op-ed, a fascinating op-ed this morning in the Financial Times. We are at arguably an extraordinary critical juncture, some people have said, for Europe, you know, the most critical in the last 70, nearly 75 years since the end of World War II. as you've mentioned, as Commissioner Barnier has mentioned, the UK's divorce from the European Union is due to be completed in 40 days. And then in Europe, you have parliamentary elections that will take place in May. In your op-ed this morning, and I'm going to read a critical piece that comes from it about, in this context, the rise of populism, the rise of sovereignism. Dame Minouche, you write, history suggests how this story will play out. Populists will occupy the state, engage in patronage, repress critics, and try to thwart independent judges, regulators, and the media. They will overspend to buy off their supporters, ending either in a fiscal or balance of payments crisis, or both. If I can come first to yourself, this is a very dark but very succinct view. How do you see the possibility of preventing, reverting that position? And then clearly we'll come then to President Monti. Thank you.
I think that we're at a moment where we need to rethink our models. The current capitalist economic model, as Mario Monti has said, has become probably a bit complacent, and many of its excesses have been allowed to take hold. And I think we need to rethink what's happened to income inequality, what's happened to wealth inequality, what's happened to social mobility in our societies. The fairness of the system is very much in question, and I think we need to rethink that. We also need to look at what's happened to our political models, and people have lost faith in democracy. There are too many vested interests with too much power. Citizens, I often joke, when I first came to the London School of Economics, I had never sort of managed in a university environment before, and people know that universities are very difficult to manage. So I asked the innocent question, where does the power lie? And someone said to me, it's wherever you're not. And I think citizens in most democracies feel that way now. Where does the power lie? Oh, it lies in Brussels, or it lies at the IMF, or it lies in some distant corporation that's determining my future. And we need to find a way to make citizens feel they have a bit more power again. And that means looking critically at decentralization of decision-making and really providing more power at the local level. And I think our social models need to be reinvented. These issues of identity are quite complicated in multicultural societies. What holds our societies together anymore? It's, when our societies were more homogeneous, people were more willing to share. They were more willing to support a welfare state and have universal health care. When people are very different, you have to remind them what holds them together. And rethinking what identity means in modern multicultural societies is a big project. I think there's a way through it. It's complicated, but I think there's a way through it. But again, we have spent too little time investing in reminding ourselves why we have a common project as nations. And I think those three areas, rethinking our economic model, rethinking our politics, and rethinking our social model, is the only way that we will provide a counter-narrative to the populist narrative.
Thank you. President Monti, if I could, turn to you and I'll pass the mic. Thank you. How do you see, following on from Dame Minouche's op-ed today and the comments you made, the possibility to push back against the steps being taken by, populism towards institutions as well, and overtaking institutions? I think particularly is interesting also to expand that to looking into how academic institutions such as Bocconi and LSE, clearly your dual degree, but also how in enabling and educating leaders of the future, you can turn the view away from turning inwards, as we see as the political process at the moment, but to turning outwards again to a multipolar, to an international world.
I think it is a matter of education, of pedagogical efforts, but honestly, the place where this is most difficult is perhaps not with students in universities, but with decision-making in governments. And if I draw on my experience at the European Union, to remain close to the topic of today, Brexit, I just paid tribute to the supremacy and the merit of the UK as the advocate of the market economy, of a well-functioning market economy. But if we want to have a social market economy, if we want the reasons that Minouche mentioned in her brilliant article in the FT today, which have brought to populism not to operate because they are taken care of before, then I believe that another component of British thinking played rather negatively in the European construction. Let me be a bit more clear. The more we integrate a market, let's leave aside for a moment one of the four freedoms, free movement of people, which has been the most controversial recently, partly determining the result of the referendum. But if we take the integration of markets more broadly speaking, that's needed for companies to develop a broad-based domestic market throughout Europe and become more competitive globally so as to increase employment, etc. But if the policies to integrate the markets, which are, by the way, legally the most forceful in the hands of the European Union, single market and competition, are not paralleled to an equal degree by policies to take care of the social aspects of the social market economy, then people will perceive what? Will perceive, and totally rightly so, that the creation of a single market, of a deeper and deeper, better and better functioning single market, wait a moment, is helping capital to flow to the places where the taxation is more convenient, will help companies to select the location where the state aids given by countries are most attractive. And who remains without the ability to exploit the advantages from integration? Workers, but not highly skilled workers who, like big professionals or sports stars or music stars, can and do select their place of fiscal residence depending on the fiscal niches, but the low-skilled workers, which are not a mobile factor of production until they make the discontinuity decision of migrating. So that's why I believe we will not be able to have a socially sustainable single market unless we have some higher degree of tax coordination among member states, so that whatever remains of tax competition does not work systematically in favor of capital and corporations and against ordinary people. This is just one example. And then I think this should be one of the ways in which the non-populists who care about European integration should improve capitalism in Europe if they want to have integration sustainable.
No, I completely agree with that. And actually, there is an international dimension to that, which is to have greater, the pressure on certain corporations who manage to locate themselves globally and avoid local taxation. some international effort needs to be put to setting that right so that people will feel that global capitalism is fair. Otherwise, the current setup makes people feel that, you know, these organizations are completely taking advantage of the current system.
And as Minouche advocates, there have been some short phases in which the sense of responsibility globally has been higher. I have in mind the G20 at the time you were at the IMF, after the first big financial crisis, which acted a bit to crack on the tax havens, for example. But if that global cooperation, besides the fact that now the president of the US wants to dismantle it, but at any rate, if that global cooperation is not vested in specific laws and institutions, when the crisis goes away, back to complacency and no longer this cohesive discipline.
Do you see, I mean, you both brought up this point, as you said, about a crisis in capitalism, with President Monti coming up with this, you know, your fascinating thought that when there was communism as a rival system, that capitalism was better held to account and a better form of capitalism as you saw it. We're hearing very much, particularly from younger people today, and we're going to come to the floor in just a moment. We'll be fascinated to hear your views as well, particularly from the students, but that capitalism is in crisis, that it has lost its way. Do you see a possibility that your institutions as well are going to be able to create not just a sort of a sense of capitalism or points that you mentioned, such as fiscal controls for big tech, such as you've mentioned, but more a sense of capitalism which is about corporate purpose rather than corporate gain?
Well, if there are two areas where I believe progress has been achieved in the last years, not fast enough, but faster than I would have expected, those are areas called corporate social responsibility and incorporating decisions about sustainability in the corporate system. I would not have expected that something which does not have an immediate short-term return in a primitive capitalism sense could nevertheless become so important, even though maybe through the perception of a company and therefore the consequences on the financial markets, etc. But here, my colleagues who deal specifically with these things will know much, much better. But I believe that all the progress that have been tried and partly reached in terms of corporate governance and of responsibility vis-à-vis stakeholders other than the shareholders, etc., go in the good direction, don't they?
I mean, I think it's interesting that Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, in his annual letter this year, spent all his time talking about purpose. And, you know, I'm sure it was for honorable reasons, but actually what he was really focused on was the fact that over the next couple of decades, about 30 trillion in assets is going to be inherited by young people. And their investment preferences show a high preference for concerns around environmental, social, and governance issues. And he was basically sending a warning message to CEOs around the world to say, if you want these people to hold on to your shares, you better have a good story to tell on environmental, social, and governance issues. And it would be very interesting to hear whether young people in the room who may be inheritors at some point of some of these assets would share those views.
Do we have any questions from the floor? Upstairs, perhaps? I see lots of faces upstairs. This is a wonderful... Yes, gentleman here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to share another view, maybe, because I think that what is happening with Brexit right now is really negative for Europe and for the United Kingdom, but at the same time shows us what happens if you trigger Article 50, shows us what are the consequences, where the United Kingdom is going and what they are losing. For me, the real threat for European Union is the countries who want to stay inside, but at the same time do not comply with human law treaties, or I want to say Poland, but what is happening about the judicial system. What are the tools that Europe can use to prevent showing off a system which tolerates certain things happening inside Europe?
I'll just check. Do we have any more questions? We can take a couple at the same time. Yes, a gentleman right in the centre at the back, please.
I have a question on taxation. You both mentioned that it's fair and important to have fair taxation across Europe in order to redistribute part of the value chain that capital and large enterprises have extrapolated from labor. Now, it's public knowledge, the OECD has reported it several times, that the large firms, in particularly tech firms, elude more than 20 billion euro inside Europe. And they do it legally. They use Ireland, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So the famous case of the Starger vis-à-vis Apple, or it's in the UK, you know, Facebook paying £3 million of taxes, Google and Apple less than 7 million per year. So the question I ask is, first, why Europe has not been able to stop the biggest tax illusion on the planet with 3 member states? That one, destroy the unity, the competitiveness of the single market, and creates huge monopolies in America, which then destroy our European companies. And who benefits out of it?
Thank you. Would you like to take that? Minouche, yes, please.
The easy one. I'll give Mario the hard one. I'll take the easy one. You're quite right. I think the good news is that the OECD is actually working on a proposal now which will try and address this, which says these companies cannot create some artificial headquarters where they don't produce or consume anything, and actually they should be taxed on the basis of where their product is consumed. And that proposal is currently being put forward in the OECD. I think a lot of the tech companies have now realized that public opinion has moved and that they will have to accept those proposals. And I think we should all do everything we can to back that. Who benefits at the moment? Their shareholders. Their shareholders, I mean, why has the share price of those companies rocketed in the last decade? Because they have been incredibly effective at what is called tax efficiency. And I think that needs to be reversed. It's really unacceptable that they don't pay their fair share.
I want to take also the difficult part by going one step further on your topic, Minouche. 3 countries were mentioned, Ireland, Netherlands, Luxembourg. Everybody knows that there are favorable tax regimes over there. Why isn't the EU better able to cope with that? The reason is simple. That is, under the current treaty, all tax decisions have to be made by unanimity. That is, all member states need to be on board for the EU to be able to take a decision on tax matters. So, the effort made since many years already by the EU has been the following. It's not possible to order to Ireland to have a higher corporate tax rate than the 12.5% that it has, because it is sufficient Ireland to say no for that order to be impossible. But I say we because I was still there when we made this effort to push to the extreme limit the notion of state aid, because if a matter can be seen to be a state aid problem, then the Commission has the remarkable powers that it has in competition matters, where it does not need unanimity, does not need the agreement of the Council, and can act. So, according also to the laws, to the case law of the court, etc., it has been seen that one can consider a state aid if, for example, Ireland applies 12.5% generally, but applies to Apple, to make a very realistic case, 6%. Then that portion is called a selective tax advantages that can be hit through competition policy decisions. Mrs. Vestager, the commissioner, did this 2 years ago, and she ordered, and that order is being followed concretely, the government of Ireland to ask Apple to reimburse the government of Ireland itself of some 12 or 13 billion euros that it had perceived as unfair and illegal under state aid laws help. On the more important and to me more extraneous first question about what happens if a member state of the EU does not apply the principles of the state of law, is that basically the question? Well, legally, the Commission does have the instruments to enforce the application of the principles, the division of powers, etc., up to the nuclear measure, I think it is Article 7, of proposing the expulsion of a member state from the EU. Understandably, it is a bit hesitant to use that, but in theory it is there. There is presently an effort being made of linking the regional aids, the structural aids that the EU gives to member states, to whether or not they comply with the principles and the laws of the state of right. This is currently discussed in the package on the multi-annual financial framework, the budget of the EU for the next 7 years. It seems, following in the press, that several member states are against making this link. And this is again a topic which requires unanimity, so I don't know where they will end up.
Thank you very much. We are drawing to a conclusion now. I wanted, as we conclude this very wide-ranging debate and discussion, to return briefly before the final question to the words of Mr. Barnier, who said, if you want to preserve the achievements of the European Union to date, you must fight for them. Share your vision of Europe, engage yourself, particularly ahead of European elections. Both Dame Minouche and President Monti, you have both yourselves had long careers where you have been committed to social action, you know, in terms of what you've done for Europe, for world institutions, for the IMF. I wondered, I know when I was always a student, I was always desperately keen to have advice from people such as yourselves. I wondered, given this very particular, difficult, with some moments of hope in time, what would your advice be to students today about the way to seize opportunity? Particularly, I think, President Monti, you'd also mentioned as we were coming in a world where we've moved from country risk, and as we both discussed, to multipolar risk in the world.
You wanted to go first.
Okay, I'll do the hard. All right, I'll do the hard start this time. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say to young people is vote. Please vote. You know, if young people had voted, if young people had voted in the UK, the outcome would have been different. It couldn't be more straightforward. So that would be my number one piece of advice. But I think the second thing I'd say is this generation is facing very unique pressures that certainly I didn't face. You know, they've grown up in the world where the internet was taken for granted. And that has made you much more globally connected and globally aware than previous generations. And yet at the same time, that global competition has probably created a greater sense of insecurity for this generation. You know, you're competing not against your classmates or the people living in your city, but you're competing with every other young person in the world who's competing for the same jobs that you're competing for. And so it's that paradox of being globally aware and global citizens in some ways in your mindset, yet also economically more insecure. And I think that's a very unusual combination, and I would just encourage you to see beyond the current pressures of global competition and retain the values that global awareness has brought you. Young people tend to be much more idealistic and optimistic than old folk. But right now, I think we need the voices of globally aware young people more than ever. So that would be my little bit of advice. Mario.
My advice would not be different. I would insist on feel, as no doubt you do feel more and more, global citizens, which does not mean that you have to dismiss your pride in being an Italian citizen or a British citizen, and try to be stronger and stronger in your ideas. Do not become a passive relativist without views. Try to have views of your own, of which you are convinced, provided there are two accompanying conditions. One, that you review their convictions from time to time as developments unfold. And secondly, this will be badly needed as we move forward, be tolerant. And finally, be convinced, and this is a huge responsibility incumbing on each of you, that unlike your predecessors in terms of generations, you individually can change the world. This is not something I'm saying just to boost your morale. By the way, it's a big responsibility if you have the power to change the world. But now more than ever, through a startup which invents a new way of doing things or a new way of thinking, you can change the world ultimately by voting, by not excluding for yourself some sort of civic and maybe one day even political commitment. You can change the world. As a matter of fact, today you either change the world or the world will be changed by others, not necessarily to your advantage. And this university, like LSE, are trying to provide you modestly with all the instruments needed to comply to the very demanding advice that the leaders of your two institutions are giving you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both very much indeed for a wide-ranging and fascinating and inspiring, ultimately, debate. Thank you.
And may I, on behalf of the two of us and of all of us here, thank you very, very much for your direction of the discussion. Thank you very much.